All right. Thank you all for your patience. It's good to see everybody. And I want to start off with, first of all, can everyone hear okay? Yeah, okay, great. I want to start off at first with a tie back to last week. So last week we started out, and I'm sad that, you know what, I'll wait and see if Curtis will show up. I'll answer more of Curtis's question. Hopefully he'll show up, and if not, I'll answer it at the end. But I've got two questions that I got from Mara this week, and I want to address them a little bit now and then later on in the course. So the first question that Mara asked was, and I'm paraphrasing her, but is Judaism a race, a religion, or both? Personally, I'm not comfortable enough with our modern definition of race to answer that question decisively, but I can say a few things that might help. So one is that regardless of religious practice, Ashkenazi Jews in particular are predisposed to certain genetic abnormalities such as taste sacs and a tendency towards breast cancer. And so these are things genetically that we always have to get checked out if we have that kind of ancestry. I think speaking in terms of race can also be helpful when we're trying to define what's anti-Semitism and what's not. We are a group of people who have been and still are to some extent persecuted, not because of our religious beliefs, but because of our heritage and our history. But talking about race isn't so helpful when we're talking about Judaism, because Jews come from all over the world and bring food and language from wherever they come from. And we'll talk about this a little bit later today. And then two, with conversion and interfaith marriage happening so much in the Jewish community right now, we've got a whole bunch of new cultures that are coming into the Jewish tradition as well. So ultimately, I would say that Judaism is a religion. I wouldn't really call it a race, but I'd call it a way of life more than anything else. So that can include identity, food, books, music, rituals, the people we hang out with, religious beliefs, and also, to a tiny extent, also genetics. Is that helpful at all? Maybe?
No, anyway, sorry. Addressing the...
No, you're
yeah,
good.
definitely.
We're too used to being on
Okay,
Zoom
good.
ourselves where you don't have to,
Right. All right. So hopefully that's helpful. And if you have any more questions about that, of course you can ask. I also got a question from Mara. Is God infallible, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent? How does it work that is God all powerful? And if that's the case, how does tradition change over time? Because we talked about conservative Judaism seeing Jewish tradition as changing over time. So maybe this is a cop-out answer, but our 8th week together, we're going to spend a whole hour and a half on it. But every Jewish individual has a different perspective of God, sometimes even a different perspective every day. I know my perspective changes a little bit every day, but for me, God has perfect intentions and infinite power, but is always learning what to do with that power. And we're learning in partnership with God, so we learn from one another. God's word in Torah is binding, and our and God's interpretations of that word are bound to change over time. And we'll talk more about that later, but that's a little bit of my perspective. Are there any other questions that have come up this week after last week's learning?
Oh, I had one
Yeah.
after service Friday.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I noticed head coverings. Are women supposed to wear head coverings like during services?
Yeah, so head coverings are a great question. At Agudath Achim, we always ask men to put on head coverings as they come in the building. And for women, it's so head coverings, I'll take a step back. Head coverings for the sake of prayer are a custom, and it's a custom that's happened so long that it's become almost like law. It was a custom that men would wear these head coverings while they prayed. But it was also seen in religious tradition that men had more obligation than women. And that's changed in the past few decades. And so it's a question, now that women have that equal obligation, should we take on head covering? Mm-hmm. Or because it's just a custom, should we just leave it be? So another layer to add to that is that in Orthodox communities, married women will cover their head and sometimes even cover their hair. So then there's the question, and it's really up to anybody, does it seem like because now women have that equal obligation that now it's a woman should also put on a head covering? Yeah. So you can put on a head covering. There's nothing stopping you. And for some people, for some women, they even make it their obligation to put on a head covering during services.
Got it. And can that be anything? Like I see you have all these nice headbands.
Yeah, you can wear a headband, you can wear a hat, you can wear a kippah. Mm-hmm. So I make sure that my head is always covered in some way wherever I go.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. Not just for synagogue, but everywhere. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Great. All right. Any other questions from this past week? All right. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to what we're going to be talking about today. And I might jump around a little bit because at some point Rabbi John is going to pop on, and at some point Rabbi Elise Wechterman is going to pop on as well. They're going to be telling us today about their different movements of Judaism. So before Rabbi Wechterman pops on, I want to give a little bit of context, and I want to talk a little bit about the conservative movement. So today is going to be focused on Jewish diversity. First, we'll talk about different movements, and then we'll talk about different places where Jews have come from throughout history and different Jewish cultures. So modern Jewish denominations are actually very recent. I mean, in the big span of history, they're very recent. They're a response to the Enlightenment and emancipation, especially in Germany in the late 18th century. So these movements this idea of different Jewish movements really started in Germany, but trickled over to America as well. Reform Judaism began really first as an embrace of the modern world, praying the vernacular, incorporating music, and wearing clerical robes, no distinctive clothing that makes you a Jew. So for a very long time in Reform synagogues and in some Reform synagogues today, they wouldn't wear a kippah or a talit. They wouldn't wear a head covering or a prayer shawl at all because we didn't want any distinctive clothing to separate us from everyone else in society. We were now free German and American citizens just like everybody else. Why would we need distinctive clothing, right? No keeping kosher, no keeping Shabbat. So they embraced this individual choice of mitzvot, and they focused on the lessons we can learn from Torah and prophets and from the rabbis and the holiday traditions. Rabbi John is going to tell us a little bit more about modern practice of Reform Judaism. That's the movement I grew up in as well. If you live in Shreveport, if you've been to B'nai Zion, you should go and just see what it's like. It's kind of, B'nai Zion is more of an old-fashioned Reform Judaism. It's kind of the Reform Judaism I grew up with 20 years ago or 25 years ago. So Rabbi Jana will talk more about that later. And what's really interesting, I think, is that we often talk about orthodoxy as the hello, Rabbi Jana. We often talk about orthodoxy as the root of Judaism, as the historical norm, right? But really, orthodoxy developed as a response to Reform Judaism. Yeah.
What's Hasidic then? I know it's is it in the Orthodox category?
Yeah, we'll get there. So orthodoxy developed as a response to Reform Judaism. So the Khatam Sofer is just one one rabbi who gave a response, and his idea was that anything new is forbidden by the Torah. So he's one of many of the founders of many streams of what we now call orthodoxy. And when we talk about orthodoxy, it's really important to keep in mind that orthodoxy isn't just one movement, that there are Orthodox Jews who will think that other Orthodox Jews are heretics. There are lots of different groups. And Emma just asked about Hasidic Jews. So Hasidim, we'll call them, are basically different groups of Orthodox Jews who have their textual sources somewhat in Kabbalah, some more than others, and then also B, who their traditions and their clothing, their dress, their rituals are informed by rabbis by a rebbe. So some of them have modern rebbes who are the descendants of the big rebbe who started it all, and some of them have not had a rebbe for a while but still look back to that founding rabbi. So if you go to New York or Israel, you might see Jews who are dressed in different distinctive hats, different distinctive outfits. These are different groups of Hasidim. And these are all technically Orthodox Jews, but they disagree on a lot of things with other Orthodox Jews as well. So hopefully, I didn't have a chance to get a Orthodox colleague today, but hopefully next week I'll be able to bring somebody. So conservative Judaism, which is what we are here at Agudath Achim, came on two fronts. Actually, I didn't even explain what Orthodox Judaism is and believes. So even though they all disagree on lots of things, basically a basic Orthodox belief is that the Torah and then later specific writings, so later rabbinic text, were both revealed by God at Mount Sinai, and therefore their obligations are entirely binding. The variations in Orthodoxy depend on the rabbis that each school relies on, but in general, Orthodoxy either says that it doesn't change at all, or changes very, very slowly if there is change at all. But really, it's our idea of what Orthodoxy is now is a response to the Reform movement in the 18th century, 18th and 19th centuries. So we've got Orthodox, we've got Reform, and in the conservative movement started kind of turn of the 19th century, where rabbis from the Reform movement kind of thought, oh, this is going too far. Right? We want to wear talit and kippah. We want to pray. We want to do the traditional prayer service. We want to keep kosher. There's this famous meal that Reform rabbis had that was later called I don't know if it was called the Treifa banquet at the time or later, but it's called the Treifa banquet, and Treifa means non-kosher. And they had shrimp and cheeseburgers and every sort of non-kosher food possible. This was a group of Reform rabbis, and after that and surrounding that incident, a group of those rabbis said, this is too far. So the first rabbis in America who really got into conservative Judaism were these rabbis who broke off from the Reform movement. And then kind of the second wave, or at the same time, similar time, were Jews who moved from Eastern Europe, who wanted the traditions of their ancestors because the traditions they had grown up with looked like Orthodoxy, but at the same time, they wanted to enjoy living among their neighbors. They were in the New World. They wanted to try things out, right? So we had this meeting of two worlds, of those rabbis who found their home in the Reform movement, but that was too far, and of people, immigrants, who found their home in what looked like Orthodoxy, but that was too far. So they met somewhere in the middle. We were really big tent Judaism. And at the same time, in the scholarly world, there was a similar movement that developed in Germany. So conservative theology and practice. Who are we? So there's a really easy way to describe us. I think, well, actually two. One is big tent Judaism, right? We're kind of squarely in the middle. And then also tradition and change. So we see Torah and Talmud as sacred, and the ways in which we read Torah and Talmud teach us that our practice has to change as society and technology and our understanding of the world change as well. The practical result is that your average conservative affiliated Jew might not seem, or might not always seem, as outwardly observant as an Orthodox affiliated Jew, but their synagogue space acts as an ideal to work towards. So we have a kosher building, right? The rabbis at this synagogue keep Shabbat in a traditional way. So my vision here is to inspire individuals to take on just a bit more of that life of mitzvot every day, keeping kosher, keeping Shabbat, inviting people to slowly but surely expand their comfort zones, right? I try every day to do a little bit more. I'm certainly not perfect with mitzvot, and I don't expect other people to be either, but I expect us all to be pushing a little bit farther. As for services, other than egalitarianism, conservative services are going to look a lot similar to Orthodox services. Our liturgy is very much the same. We might skip some things to make services shorter, or we might give a little bit more explanation to make services longer, but by and large, we have the same liturgy. So if you're used to a conservative service, you could go to an Orthodox service and know exactly what's going on. With regards to gender, we see women as obligated to all the same mitzvot, except for those that are anatomical, as men. We lead services, we count in a minyan, we wear talit and tefillin, which is a prayer shawl, and those little boxes that you might have seen pictures of that happen during morning prayer. But because of their upbringing and because this is kind of a new idea, some women might still not be comfortable with putting on a talit, putting on a prayer shawl, or putting on tefillin, or leading services. So you might see when the gabbai, when the person who's going around asking for honors comes up to a woman in the sanctuary, you might notice some women say, no, I'm not comfortable with this, because they grew up not being able to go up to the bima. So some women still aren't comfortable with those ideas. With regards to LGBTQ issues, so most conservative rabbis will agree to perform same-sex marriages and embrace LGBTQ community members, and multiple halachic papers have been written on the subject. So if you're interested in diving deeper, I can send you the right articles. We've done a lot of learning on that in this congregation, and I'm always happy to do more. And there's also this wonderful teshuvah, this wonderful response that was just written about how important it is for us to accept gender non-binary and transgender individuals into our congregations as well. Personally, I chose conservative Judaism because I believe practicing halakha, or Jewish law, is an ideal way for us to show love of God. And at the same time, when I read our traditional texts, I can't read them in a way that's not egalitarian. I grew up in a Reform home with a female rabbi, with the first deaf female rabbi. And I grew up in a family of strong women, and I couldn't imagine us being any less obligated than men and any less able to lead a community. So for me, egalitarianism was really what brought me to conservative Judaism rather than orthodoxy. And I know that if you look in your book and you want to take notes at all, because I know Emma is, the one other question is, in Orthodoxy, who is a Jew? So in conservative Judaism, who is a Jew? So in conservative Judaism, a Jewish person is either born from a Jewish mother or went through a formal conversion process. So That process includes mikvah, which is a ritual bath, mila, which is circumcision for men, or hatafat dam brit, which is an alternative for men who have already been circumcised, and beit din for everybody, where the convert will go in front of a group of 3 rabbis and answer an interview. But leading up to answer some interview questions, but leading up to that, there's a whole lot of learning that needs to be done. This class is one of those steps of learning, but not the only step, but one of those steps of learning that I always require at the synagogue. And also another point to bring up too is that the person who's choosing Judaism needs to be willing to live that Jewish lifestyle. So including, taking on Shabbat in some tangible way, taking on kashrut in some tangible way, and raising Jewish children. So any questions about conservative Judaism? Sure.
Just like about Shabbat, because that was what always, because I know there are exceptions, of course, life-saving stuff. I've never known about where people stand on driving, and because I've heard that obviously Orthodox it's like you can't. I think someone told me you can't even light a candle in the house or something. Like you go to and then you walk to synagogue and there you can light a candle, but you can't when you go home. It's like literally nothing that could remotely be called work.
Yes, exactly. So this is the issue with not having an Orthodox speaker here, is that it might make sense to have that context, but we'll talk about Shabbat. We'll have a whole class about Shabbat, but basically Shabbat observance looks like some positive things, some things that we do, and then a lot of things that we don't do, and one of those things is lighting a fire. So once Shabbat has come in, once sunset has happened on Friday afternoon until 3 stars come out on Saturday night, there are a whole lot of actions that we don't do, including lighting a fire. So then where does driving a car come in? Technically, it is forbidden to drive a car on Shabbat. But the way that our synagogues are set up in the modern world is we all live really far, or not everybody, but a lot of people will not choose where they live according to where the synagogue is. In Orthodox communities, people will choose where they live so that they can walk to synagogue. Here, not so much the case. So there was a paper written in the 1950s by a bunch of conservative rabbis, or couples of conservative rabbis, explaining why it's okay to drive a car on Shabbat. Happy to learn that paper with you, but basically, how else would we have Jewish community if we're all living so far apart? So for me, I chose to live where I live so that I could walk to synagogue, but there's an established tradition in the conservative movement of people driving to synagogue, because how else are they going to get there? Great. Other questions?
I'll save them for that day because I have lots of random things like how about switching on a light.
Yeah. So let's leave that to Shabbat. I turn on lights on Shabbat.
Okay, because I think it was describing like the most extreme observance of it, which I was like, whoa, that's
right.
pretty...
I used to not turn on lights on Shabbat. We can talk more about that.
Easier in California. In England in winter to be like 6 hours of daylight.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. Well, it looks like, let me see if I didn't get an email from Rabbi Wechterman. She's supposed to be on right now, and I will send, for anybody who requests those articles that I was speaking about, I will send them to you, and I'm happy to learn them with you too. There's a lot of really technical halachic Jewish law stuff that comes up, and I'll say too that in those articles there's a good amount of graphic detail. So there's a good amount of graphic detail. So you just have to know that in advance, that they're talking about this, that in these articles they talk about the intricacies of what sex looks like in different circumstances. So, sorry, Rabbi Wechterman, you came in at an interesting time. But
Sex is always a great way to introduce Judaism.
absolutely, absolutely. We're talking about tissue vote about LGBTQ issues in conservative Judaism. Great, and I think that was all the questions. So welcome. I'm glad to see your face. I'm glad to see you. So I'd love to introduce Rabbi Wechterman. Rabbi Elise Wechterman came to the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association as the executive director in fall of 2015. She is one of the founding faculty of Camp Havaya and served as the spiritual leader of Congregation Agudas Achim in Attleboro, Massachusetts from 2001 to 2014. Additionally, she's taught at college and adult level in lots of settings and worked broadly with children and families with special needs to create inclusive communities for Jews of all abilities and backgrounds. A graduate of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, Rabbi Wechterman brings an open and inclusive approach to teaching Jewish life and traditions. She is committed to empowering Jews and fellow travelers on their individual and unique Jewish journeys. I'm so glad that you're here, Rabbi Wechterman. Thank you so much for being here, and you are welcome to let us know your insights about
Thank you.
Judaism.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, it's 8:30. I have a grandfather clock behind me, so it just struck once on the half an hour, and we'll be done by the time it gets to striking 9. So, so thank you, Rabbi Rubenstein. I'm very glad to be here. I'm delighted to be a part of your group. I understand that you have people from lots of different backgrounds. So I'm going to do a little bit of a short intro to Reconstructionist Judaism. I'm going to try to keep that short because what I really want to do is hear your questions and answer those, because I always feel like that is a much richer experience. Reconstructionist Judaism is, and again, I have no idea what background or history or framework you have, so I'll give you the very basics. It is, if we were to talk about the 4 main streams of modern American Judaism, that being conservative, Reform, conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist. I give it to you in that order because that's the historical order. If we were to talk about those 4 streams, Reconstructionist is the newest, youngest, probably of those smallest, and it is also the one that is uniquely American in that Reform Judaism, which came first, was really founded or started in the roots of Western Europe in Germany. Conservative Judaism, which was a reaction to Reform Judaism, also came from that European milieu. Orthodox Judaism, which some people think is the oldest, but there's not really before we have something called traditional Judaism, but Orthodox Judaism as a movement and as an identity identity to itself was a reaction to that with roots in Europe. And it is only here in the American context in the 20th century that we get the creation of Reconstructionist Judaism, founded by a thinker and teacher in the early part of the century named Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan. Mordechai Kaplan, interestingly enough, grew up in an Orthodox family, received Orthodox smicha, Orthodox ordination, taught at the conservative rabbinical program after having been invited to teach at the Reform rabbinical program and having been invited to go to Israel to teach at the secular university, and then founded Reconstructionist Judaism. So in many ways, he was a man of all different streams of thoughts, and he actually did not see himself as setting out to build a new movement. He actually was creating a school of thought that he hoped and believed would be adopted by all Americans, by all Jews, such as the way people think of their thoughts and their ideas, that everyone will agree and abide by them. And so he was promoting a way of being Jewish that he hoped everyone would adopt. When that did not become the case, it's actually his son-in-law, Ira Eisenstein, who founded the Rabbinical College of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and then set out to build the movement of Reconstructionist Judaism. And that was really not until the 70s, the 1970s, that actually happened. So as a movement, Reconstructionist Judaism is quite young, quite new, and quite small. We have about 100 congregations, mostly in North America, and 400 rabbis. I happen to head the Association of Rabbis, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association, so I know exactly where those folks are. There's about 400 of them. So what's unique about Reconstructionist Judaism is that it always had as its notion that it was designing a way to be Jewish within the context in which Jews found themselves, which in this case, and in Mordechai Kaplan's experience, was the United States. He believed that we should take hold proudly of the notion that we were living in what he described as two civilizations, that Jews living in this country lived in a Jewish civilization and also an American context. We now actually talk about multiple civilizations because we know that people are multi-ethnic, have multiple identities. There are people from different parts of the world. So we talk about multiple civilizations, but he recommended and taught that we should proudly take the strongest, most ethical, most powerful teachings of those civilizations and meld them into what we were doing in our lives as individuals and as communities and as families seeking to live a Jewish life. He believed in maximalist Judaism within maximalist American democracy. So there are a few things that he took as a given that still mark what you would see in Reconstructionist communities. I will say that most of the non-Orthodox or non-traditionalist world has also moved in this direction. We just may have spelled it out first. So that is, democracy is a value. We absolutely hold to democratic decision-making in our communities, in our congregations, as well as the way that we approach Jewish practice, right? I'll talk a little bit about Jewish law and Jewish halakha in a second and how that plays in, but the role of democracy and the idea that everybody can be part of the decision-making process is very important to Kaplan. He poses the ownership of Judaism within the center of the Jewish people. Lots of times when we teach about the history of Judaism, we think, oh, Judaism is this thing that was given to the Jews by God on Mount Sinai. And it came down as a package. And then through the years, Jews have changed it and practiced different things, but really there's this original Judaism that was given down. Kaplan didn't abide by that. He didn't think that was true historically, nor did he think that that was true sociologically. He actually believes that Judaism is defined by what Jewish people do. And therefore, Judaism has always changed given the context in which Jews find themselves. And he can go back through history and show, look, when Jews were creating a Seder after the destruction of the temple, they were choosing a model for that Seder that came from the Roman Symposium. So that very core Jewish ritual of the Passover Seder did not start with Jews, was a Roman symposium. We took that and made it into something Jewish. The same thing is true throughout history. Jews have always been adapting, adopting, and changing Judaism to fit with what they know and what they experience. Kaplan wanted to make that explicit, give Jews an explicit role in changing the way they express Judaism, and giving the past a vote about how those changes are made, but not a veto. Kaplan is the person who said that the past should have a vote, not a veto, by which he meant we should study the past, we should learn from our texts, we should learn from Jewish tradition, we should be in conversation with Jewish tradition. But just because that's the way they did it in the shtetls of Poland, or in medieval Spain, or in the rabbinic time period, that doesn't mean that we have to do it that way. That's just good information as we develop our own way of doing things. That's the history. So the way we make decisions, which is a lot about how the differences in the streams of Judaism are understood. Who has the authority to tell you what's kosher? Who has the authority to tell you what should be done on Shabbat? That question is the central question about how are decisions made and who has authority. That's one of the ways that Reconstructionists understand themselves as different. And I'll do this by way of comparison. I know you're hearing from other speakers, and so I don't want to, my intention is not to denigrate, my intention is to honor, but to say in shorthand understanding, Reform Judaism says that it's up to the individual. Informed by tradition, informed by study, informed by teachings of rabbis, the individual decides how to practice Judaism. Conservative Judaism says, well, it's up to the local rabbi, the Mara Da'atra, the rabbinic authority of the local congregation, informed by the decisions made by the Law and Standards Committee of the Rabbinical Assembly, which is a group of rabbis in New York City. There's actually a specific group that puts out those decisions, that informs the decisions of the local rabbi about what is the right way to practice Judaism. Orthodox Judaism says it's the local rabbi, also informed by groups of rabbis, but those groups of rabbis are very different and in very different places. It's not one group like it is in conservative Judaism. Orthodox Judaism, it's the case that all of the people making those decisions are men. That's not true for anybody else. Reconstructionist Judaism says, well, we don't actually think it's the individual. We also don't think it's only the rabbi. We actually think it's the community, and that the community makes that decision in a process, sometimes supervised by and educated by the rabbi and other people with knowledge, but ultimately the decision about what is kashrut, what is shomer Shabbat, what is the keeping of Shabbat, is dependent upon each community to decide for itself. In reality, in America, where we have the separation of church and state, where these are religious laws and not state laws, we all know that ultimately every individual makes a decision themselves about how they're going to practice, but the influence of the community or the rabbi or the individual actually does carry different weights in how people think about it. And one of the things that attracted me to Reconstructionist Judaism is this belief in and faith in a community to wrestle with decisions and come out with a meaningful decision, a meaningful way of practice that will be meaningful for them in that moment, in that place, that may change when things change or when location changes. And it's that malleability of Reconstructionist Judaism that attracted me. A few key tenets about that Reconstructionist Judaism from Kaplan. In addition to saying that a pass has a vote, not a veto, he also taught that the concept of chosenness, which comes out of the Bible and has been with the Jewish people in various ways throughout the centuries, is one that he could not abide for both moral and ethical reasons. And so our prayer book does not have any notion of the Jews as the chosen people. He was a proponent of egalitarianism at a very early stage. In fact, this year we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of Bat Mitzvah in America. And that first Bat Mitzvah was the Bat Mitzvah of Kaplan's daughter, Judith Kaplan Eisenstein, which happened 100 years ago this year at the Society for the Advancement of Judaism in New York City. He believed that women should have full access to leadership roles in the Jewish community way back as far as 100 years ago. And that has been a hallmark of Reconstructionist Judaism. It is also the case that because of that emphasis on egalitarianism and inclusion, that therefore we also are the first, we were not the first rabbinical school to ordain women, mostly because, we were a year behind the Reform movement, and that had to do with how long it took the first women to go through the program. But we just around the same time as the Reform movement, but we are the first movement to openly ordain and endorse gay and lesbian relationships by celebrating gay and lesbian marriages, and also to ordain gay and lesbian and transgendered and queer rabbis. That is something that we're also very proud of. I think I'm going to stop there because that was a lot. And I want to actually give room for some questions and whatever else you might want to hear about.
Thank you. And we do have people here. We've just got someone with a young child and someone who's not feeling well. So
I totally understand that. I
People in the
totally
room
appreciate
as well
that.
next to me. Right. Any questions?
And feel free to write them in the chat or share them out loud.
The difficult one of defining a Jew, which is
Oh, the
yeah,
difficult one. So according
yeah.
to Reconstructionist Judaism, who is a Jew?
That's a great question. And one of the reasons why that's a great question is because I think actually everybody is struggling with that today, because the question of identity in America is such a live and rich question. The way that we think about it is that we distinguish between identity and status, right? Identity is what comes from inside. I feel like a Jew. I feel like I'm this, or I experience myself to be this, or I experience myself to be that. We don't believe that you can actually argue with someone's internal experience of identity. There are people who call themselves Jews that I may or may not think have Jewish status. I'm not going to argue with them about that. That doesn't feel like that's particularly useful argument. What I am concerned about is helping communities determine issues of Jewish status. Status is what a community decides or it confers on someone. And when do questions of Jewish status come into play? They come into play in very specific moments, right? It's about who can come up to the bima for an aliyah, for example. Who can get married to whom and call it a Jewish wedding? Who can have a bar mitzvah, right? And so some of those questions of Jewish ritual practice require an answer of status, not an answer of identity. So that's one way that we separate the questions and can say, we will work with anybody who wants to learn about Judaism and enrich their identity. But when it comes to certain rituals, there are things where we believe that you are required to have Jewish status. For us, Jewish status is any person who was born to one Jewish parent, at least one Jewish parent. And I will say, because of contemporary biology, we've had to ask questions about what about surrogate parenting, what about donor insemination. So what we've said is one Jewish parent, and that one Jewish biological parent could have contributed any of the three pieces that you need to make a human baby. That could be sperm, that could be a uterus, or that can be the egg. So any one of those three pieces can be, that if they're Jewish, that child is presumed Jewish as long as they are not raised in another tradition. So it requires both biological identity marker and a desire and a statement and an active affirmation to raise the child Jewish and not in another tradition. Or is someone who converts to Judaism under a process that we would deem an acceptable process, which we lay out in our conversion guidelines. So who is a Jew is someone who has a Jewish parent, was raised Jewish, or has converted to Judaism.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I guess I have one. I guess I'm curious about why in Reconstructionist practice there's the choice not to refer to Jews as the chosen people.
Did you hear Jade's question?
I did not.
So why in Reconstructionist Judaism is that choice not to refer to Jews as the chosen people?
So that's a great question. There's a couple of answers. There's the theological answer, which is that Kaplan did not believe in the existence of a personal God, in that there's a person up there who doing certain things and pulling strings. God is instead a much more immanent, much more diffuse experience of the world. God is the power that makes for salvation. God is what animates our drive toward goodness. So believing in that, Kaplan just doesn't believe in a God that could choose one group of people over another. So that's the theological argument. The sociological argument is that it is also not a particularly great thing for Jews to say in front of other people, and that it actually makes people angry. It is Fodder for anti-Semitism is one of the things that he was concerned about. And he was doing most of his writing in the 1930s and 1940s. So you could understand why that would be of concern for him. So that's the second argument. And then there's a third argument, which is the ethical argument, which is the one that actually is the most meaningful to me. And frankly, the reason why I was attracted to Reconstructionism, in that if you believe that all people are created in God's image, that there's an inherent divinity and inherent value in every single person, then you could have to, at a certain degree, accept that there's also an inherent value in every group of people. And so that there is no ethical way that you can place one group of people above any other group of people without justifying the possible oppression by that one group of people over another. So in a world where he claimed that democracy was important and that everybody's vote and everybody's participation matter, to set one group of people up over any other would, by definition, oppose the radical democracy and the value of every human being, that the way he understood it. And to tell you the truth, I tend to agree with that. And I think that's an incredibly important lesson for us today. And some people don't realize that when they say certain traditional prayers, the traditional prayer for coming up to the Torah, for example, says, "Thank you, God, for choosing us out of all the other people," which implies makes us better than. That's sort of the implication. Our prayers don't say that. Our prayers say, "Thank you, God, for bringing us close to your service," with the implication that everybody has a way of serving God in their own way, and that Torah is our way of serving God, but it's not necessarily better than any other Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, Zoroastrian, atheistic way of serving God.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Great. Right. Thank you so much for teaching us, and I'm so glad that you were able to make it tonight.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm happy to do it anytime. And if further questions come up after I depart, please feel free to share them with your rabbi, and she can send them to me, and I'll be happy to get written responses to you. Okay.
All right,
Thank you so much, Rabbi Rubenstein. It's really lovely.
Have a wonderful evening.
You too. Bye.
Thank you.
All right. Rabbi Jana, are you there?
Yes, here, and here.
He's here. All right. May I introduce you?
Sure. Have fun.
Wonderful. Because some of the people here know you very well, and then some of the people don't know you at all. So Rabbi Dr. Jana de Benedetti has been the spiritual leader and the rabbi at B'nai Zion congregation since 2006. B'nai Zion is our local Reform congregation here in Shreveport. She has also been the cantorial soloist at B'nai Zion and has led many services in many states and in Israel. At B'nai Zion, Rabbi Jana teaches Jewish music, Hebrew, Jewish studies, and Torah studies. Rabbi Jana has been teaching Hebrew and Jewish studies for more than 45 years, has published scholarly texts and articles, and has helped to produce record albums and songbooks of Jewish music. Rabbi Jana makes learning Hebrew and Judaism enjoyable and joyful. She is beloved in the interfaith community. Her services are warm and welcoming, and even though that was all on your bio, I can attest to all of that being true. She's also a wonderful friend. So thank you for being here, Rabbi Jana.
And how cool is it to be in Shreveport at a time when we have only women rabbis here? I mean, our whole section of the state, when I moved here in 92, it was unthinkable. And it's a pretty amazing thing. And I love being here, and I love having Rabbi Sydney as my we could say sister rabbi. So it's exciting. And thank you for letting me speak about Reform Judaism. And I was glad to be able to sit and listen to some of the histories and the distinctions and the similarities between the movements. We are also very blessed, I think, in our community. Some of the things that I noticed was all of the similarities and the ways that we have been able to interact with our movements, but some of the differences. And it's helpful. I even some of the vocabulary was good. I liked you calling it Big Tent Judaism. in reformism, when they talk about Big Tent Judaism, they talk about something that they call audacious hospitality, which is the kindness of keeping open doors and knowing that, and I don't mean that in a security perspective today, we're not saying it that way, but knowing that everyone is welcome, no matter background, etc. But I'm going to start at the beginning and try to keep this respectfully short so that you can have time for questions. And it's starting to get late, and it's been a long day for everyone. It is not surprising with the reform. You know that we are what is called the most liberal version of Judaism, I guess, official branch of Judaism. It is called Reform with an M at the end and not Reformed. And that's something important to know, because we say that it is a work in progress. I'm going to tell you a little bit of the history of Reform movement, but I think you heard some of it through this. The movement actually did begin in the 19th century in Germany, as was pointed out. And what was going on in the world in those days was that the Jews had been stuck in ghettos and stuck in communities where we weren't supposed to come out, and we weren't supposed to interact with the other people. We were restricted to what we could do. And at some point, Europe went through a time of emancipation. We were allowed out, and we were allowed to have jobs, and we were allowed to do things that other people were doing. And in order for us to do that, I think that there were some people who felt that we needed to have the capacity to be able to have a power lunch, or if it was necessary to work on Saturday, because that's when your store had to be open, then you had to do that. And it was a big struggle, because it's like Rabbi Sidney was saying, so eventually this even spilled into America, which is what started. And yes, it's true that Reform Judaism in America kind of started the process of the other movements here chronologically. But, and ironically, all of the original Reform rabbis were all Orthodox rabbis, and then were trained Orthodox first, and it's especially ironic when you hear about that infamous rabbinic school menu when they did serve a bunch of treif. I didn't remember about the cheeseburgers, but it wouldn't surprise me. I did know about the shrimp and things like that, and it's kind of still horrifying. We're not proud of that necessarily, but it was true. I don't think that you will ever see a super treif, high treif rabbinic school graduation meal ever again, but it was true, and it did help to become a springboard for the other movements to say, yeah, you've gone too far. But anyway, going back, so in the Reform movement, one of the main guiding factors is that we live in a modern world, and we are very proud of being Jewish, and we want to make sure that we are maintaining a Judaism that is meaningful in the modern world. So in America, we're doing it in ways that is maybe different in other cultures. We kind of, in other communities, I know that when you go to Israel and you go to a Reform congregation, they're shocked to hear that the sermons aren't in English or the services don't have more English in it. They think that Reform Judaism means English. It doesn't, but it was one of the first changes that happened in the Reform movement was the liturgical changes, that our services weren't only in Hebrew, that we started speaking. And initially, we'd have German in the services, and then when we came to America, we'd have English in the services. We were the first of the movements to include some sermons that weren't just a twice a year sermon. The rabbis were only giving sermons twice a year for important holidays, and Shabbat HaGadol just before Passover and High Holy Days. But we felt that lessons from the Bima were important. But we're also a movement that changes with the time, so that we are able to stay with what we think are important. For example, in the 30s and the 40s, in America, the Reform movement was kind of staunchly anti-Zionist, even the community here. B'nai Zion, by the way, B'nai Zion congregation in Shreveport is a charter member of the Reform movement. We were one of the first congregations ever to join the Reform movement, and we've been members of the Reform movement ever since then. We have been members for over 155 years now, which is kind of blows my mind to imagine that for how long we've been doing this. And it's funny because some of the things that I wanted to say my thunder got stolen as far as the history of it, is because the Reconstructionist movement did do some amazing things to begin with. I always like to say that in a lot of ways, the Reform movement is in some ways 10 years ahead of the conservative movement when it comes to some of the issues, like the egalitarian services, that we always let women into services together. We weren't separating men and women during services like Orthodox congregations do, that women were counted in a minyan, that women were ordained. In America, women were ordained first in the Reform movement, and that it took almost 10 years for the conservative movement to ordain women, which didn't mean that the women weren't working at it. I had a lot of friends who were rabbi material even just before they were permitted to be ordained, and they were studying and they were learning and they were leaders in the community, and they were allowed to be. So key points, things like informed decisions, which is something that was brought up. It is true that there are, that to some extent, it's not that each individual makes their own decisions, but each individual tries. Each individual is supposed to be able to determine whether the customs and the traditions are meaningful to them, and they are allowed to feel fully Jewish, even if they don't keep everything. So for example, you come into our services and everybody may not be wearing a kippah, or everyone may not be wearing a talit in the morning services. But I can tell you, when I first got here in the early 90s, even the rabbis weren't supposed to be wearing a kippah. And all of this has evolved over time. And now you'll see that I will never lead a service without a kippah on, although I might be in the building without one. But I wouldn't go into a Gudat Achim without my kippah on, because I keep that tradition, and I won't. Anyway, my observance level is different. I get to tell you a little bit about my personal journey as well. And my personal journey is a little bit different than other people in the Reform movement. But I'm trying to answer the questions, and I bounced around a little bit. You will find now, and you will find this in all of the movements, less so in Orthodoxy, but you'll get Orthodoxy to speak about that there's a strict kind of old worldly kind of Orthodoxy, and there's a modern Orthodoxy. But in the Reform, the Conservative, the Reconstructionist movements, there's a huge spectrum of levels of observance. So for example, I keep Shabbat and I keep kosher, and my house is a strictly kosher house, and I do my personal observance and my family's observance. It may not always be identical to Rabbi Sidney's and Rabbi Feivel's, and I appreciate the kind of thought and concern and respect that we've been able to give to each other about that. I was infamous one day I went into a Jewish bookstore in Muncie, New York, and they called me Reformadox. When I was growing up, my grandparents belonged to conservative congregations. We would never have driven to services. We would only walk to services. We wouldn't write on Shabbat and things like that. I do drive to get to services, even though I live like half a block away from the synagogue, but I still don't write on Shabbat and other things. And it's kind of funny to think that where the spectrum is. When I was growing up, that was called the Conservadox congregation. The congregation where my grandparents belonged had just accepted to count women. They had just accepted that women and men could sit together. It was still really hard on them to imagine counting women. They were always way happier to have 10 men to be able to count. And if there were women there too, then they were kind of sort of pretending that the women were counted. But a lot of that has changed, obviously, over the years in the conservative movement, and it depends on where it is and the kind of community that you lived in. My grandparents lived in a community where the Sephardic Jews were all Orthodox Jews that would all walk to services, and we would all walk to services and things like that. So it really depended a little bit on the community where you were, the kind of observance level that you had, which even brings us to here. There are observances based on cultural background, based on personal needs. You're going to find that in the Reform movement today, I think that the statistics are that just over half of all of the marriages are interfaith marriages, and it's allowed. When I got here 30 years ago, the rabbis, not all rabbis would officiate at interfaith marriage. Not all Reform rabbis will officiate at interfaith marriages. But then when issues came up like same-sex marriage and rights for LGBTQ, the Reform movement was in the forefront again at fighting the fight in the for the rights for people to be married. And I watched a lot of changes, and I'm grateful for the changes that acknowledge people as people. And I am grateful that Reform movement allows for the idea that you get to also decide, to some extent, informed decisions. Remember, we're always talking informed decisions about what your level of observance should be and could be, and that it's always encouraged to reevaluate and continue to progress. One of the meaningful ways, I think, of looking at it that I think compares to what Rabbi Sidney had said was that one of the reasons that we feel that there's an obligation to be able to make decisions is that it's not that the commentaries are all coming from God. There are many Reform Jews who believe that even the Torah doesn't come from God. It's not a Sinai moment, that it was put together by a number of people. But we do believe that it's not so much that it's that Torah is a way of reaching toward God, rather than God sometimes commanding us, or that Torah contains the word of God rather than it being the word of God. And I think you'll find some Reform Jews seeing it that way. Ritual may be important in Reform Judaism, but the ethical teachings are a priority in Reform Judaism. You will find that, and please don't think that I'm trying to say that it is not important in any of the other movements. I'm just saying that it is a priority, that social action is one of the most important things that we do to be Jewish, to take care of the world, to take care of each other, to care about God, is how we treat each other. And so you'll find that often it's I know that the people, my congregants in their 90s now, for example, when they were coming up on confirmation, which is a Reform movement kind of threw confirmation into the mix of life cycle events. In the early days, Reform movement did away with bar and bat mitzvah. And it didn't kind of come back until the late 60s. And then when it did, women and men equally at 13 all became adults at 13 and did a service. But confirmation was something that the Reform movement felt that 13-year-old is kind of too young for a child to be making a decision about their future and their faith, and to be taking on those commitments. And so they instituted this confirmation at about 10th grade, when you get to have different kinds of theoretical and theological conversations with young adults. And so when we have confirmation classes, and I forgot where I was going with that. I forgot. I started, and I've been taking myself on all these trails, and I'm very, very tired. I've got some notes here, and I was hoping to the egalitarian. Nope, we already did that. Anyway, lots of change. Ritual. You'll find that many Jews in the Reform movement now are care more about Hebrew. We've had more and more Hebrew in our services, but we are not approaching what the conservative congregations do here still. And that's for better or for worse. I know a lot of people, when I'm going to tell you something kind of interesting in my journey, is that when my family moved into the only house that my family had bought, and we did what we called shul shopping. We lived up in New York State, in upstate New York, and there were synagogues everywhere, there of every flavor. And they found a rabbi there who explained what was going on, and he made the service feel really meaningful. And we were familiar with the service. We knew when to turn pages and what to do. And we knew the melodies, and we knew that all. But there was something really powerful about understanding why we did what we did. And some of that was because we were doing parts of the service in English, because we may have known how to v'ahavta, but we may not have known what all the words were. And all of a sudden, we we were able to hold on to what the meaning was of all of those things. And I remembered how wonderful that felt. And it wasn't just our family, it was lots of people, that it was a way for us to hold on to Judaism and understand what was going on. We weren't doing things just by rote. We really understood it, and we had a role in how we participated and practiced. When I watched the generations go by, sometimes people don't know, and I think that sometimes Reform movement gets a bad rap for being bad reputation for being what I sometimes call the don't gotta religion. That I want to be a Reform Jew because I don't got to keep kosher and I don't got to keep Shabbat and I don't got to do that. And I think that that's a really sad way of looking at Reform Judaism. I don't think that's what it is at all. I think that you need to consider about keeping kosher. You need to consider about keeping Shabbat, and you have to figure out what the guidelines are. If you can ask whether it's meaningful to you or how to make it meaningful to you. That's what it's supposed to be a Reform Jew. It's not supposed to be, I get to not do whatever I want and still say that I'm Jewish. All right, so having said all that, that's a kind of a regular chat, but I went for a while. But I talked about gender LGBTQ. Rabbi Robinson, the rabbi before me, gave an amazing sermon one time about talking to one of the senators from Louisiana who said, don't you know what it says in the Bible that, and the rabbi says, yeah, I read the Bible in its original. And let me ask you a question. He said, what does the senator think about the shrimp industry in Louisiana? And the guy said, well, it's one of our most important industries. And the rabbi said, do you know that the same word that God used in the Bible for shrimp, that abomination, the word you're translating as abomination, is the same word that God used in that section? How is it that you know better than God did what it means? And how can you talk about it that way? Which doesn't mean that Rabbi Robinson was saying that he thought that that section in the Torah that this guy was reading in translation meant what the senator had interpreted it as, but he also meant that if you're not supposed to have shrimp, what the heck, why are we pushing shrimp? And so the Reform movement's been very important to pushing what we think of as important matters for what constitutes being human and how to treat everyone decently. Definition of who is a Jew. I am going to be honest that it's been, I think, more than 10 years ago that the Reform movement changed their definition of what being Jewish is. And I don't know if it's changed since then. And I'm imagining it must have. And I've got to look that up. I don't know what because we haven't had, our biennials and things like that. And that's usually when I get to see our laws, but the way they interpret the laws. But it was a while ago that they said, look at all of the families that are raising their children Jewish when only the father is Jewish. It is appropriate for those children who know that they're Jewish, they're growing up Jewish, they feel that they're Jewish, for them to feel that they are Jewish. And they use Torah as a way of proving that was a legitimate way of looking at what being a Jewish is, at least as far as the Reform movement was interpreting it, saying, look at the patriarchs and most of the biblical people, they were the fathers were Jewish, so the children were Jewish. And now we're saying, because in the Talmudic period it changed, so the women, for practical reasons, but now why can't we go back to having both? And so we always make our policy decisions based on what we look at the laws, we look at the traditions, and we try to make them based on all of it. So someone is Jewish, whether they had a father who was Jewish or a mother, a parent, let's say, who was Jewish. And I don't know, and maybe Rabbi Sidney, maybe you had studied, you've heard about it, whether some of the issues that Rabbi Elise had brought up, whether the Reform movement has policies on it. I really don't know about whether if it was, I know that questions had come up to me and I researched them. If there's a surrogacy and things, we've been talking about them, but not the same. So I want to look into that. I know that we've got to be thinking about it, but I don't know if there's a policy yet. I think I've talked a little bit about my experience in the movement, and I know I go around all over the place because there's so much I want to say, but I think that I've shared a bunch. And as Rabbi Lee said, if there's Any other questions that you have for me, even if our time is up, obviously you're always welcome to ask. And I'm so glad that you're taking this class with Rabbi Sidney.
Thank you, Rabbi. Questions for Rabbi Jana?
Yes, ma'am. I had a question.
Oh, good. I hear you.
So, so I was wondering what conversion looked like in the reform aspect of it.
That's a really good question. And it's a question that I can talk about as a formal thing and then as an informal thing. There's a guideline that I have worked with so yes, obviously, if you go through mikvah and you go through the same things that Rabbi Sidney said, obviously that would be considered a conversion. But again, if you look biblically, that was not what was included biblically. The Reform movement, the rabbi who was here for 45 years, Rabbi Lefkowitz, part of what I started to say is that there is a Talmudic dictum that says that the law that is your local law is the law that you keep. And there's a minhag hamakom, that you keep the rules, the customs that are the local customs. There was a custom at B'nai Zion for many generations that if you considered yourself Jewish, the rabbi was considering you Jewish. There did not have to be any kind of a ceremony. And what did that mean? That meant that if you were, let's say, married, because you could still have civil marriage, for example, if you were married and you wanted to be buried in the Jewish cemetery, even if you never had a mikvah or a milah situation where you were you converted in with using those guidelines that Rabbi Sidney mentioned, if you considered yourself Jewish and you were raising your kids Jewish and you were living a Jewish life, even if it was a Reformed Jewish life, the rabbi was going to bury you in the Jewish cemetery. And there was no reason necessarily to challenge that for that purpose, because if you wanted to be able to show that you were Jewish so that you could be buried in the Jewish cemetery, you could. And so I don't do that. I don't just say, you tell me you're Jewish, poof, you're Jewish. But I do have consideration that's on a more individual level about what the procedures are. We can do a mikvah and we can do a circumcision or a hatafat dam brit for those people who need to or want to, but we also have other procedures that we can do that are not that are also meaningful. And so I would sit down with each individual and I would find out, what are your needs for wanting to become Jewish? Are you planning to move to Israel? Are you planning to marry somebody who's Jewish? Are you planning to have Jewish children? Have you already had all of the children you're going to have? Are you already have a family plot that has nothing to do with Judaism? And you just know that your grandparents were Jewish and they raised you, so you want to feel that you're Jewish too. That might be a different answer. Especially, I mean, I will tell you about some of the circumstances that we've had where I did choose to do other types of ceremonies. And so that's somewhat on an individual basis, depending on what your needs are for conversion. And I will share with you at that time, once we're talking about it on an individual basis, what, as I say, we talk about why you're choosing to convert and what you want to do with it. It's kind of like a pedigree. You want to buy a dog and the dog has pedigree. Are you planning to show it at one of those fancy dog shows? Well, they may need to have a better pedigree than if you just want to love that dog and adopt it because it's, somebody who's abusing it. It might be a different kind of thing. And I'll say, yeah, you want to call it a Labrador? Go ahead, call it a Labrador. It obviously has something else in there. And I don't mean that to be flippant or silly about it, but it right. winds up being a little bit more of a personalized individual conversation than a blanket statement. I will be very happy to show you what the Reform movement says, and I will be very happy to discuss what the traditions have been at B'nai Zion and find out what your needs are and discuss with you on an individual basis.
Sweet. Thank you so much.
You find as rabbis sometimes, and I'm sure Rabbi Sidney has had to say this before, even in the Reform movement, certainly, and in the Reform, and even in the conservative movement. And I could tell you lots of stories, even in the Orthodox, that sometimes a question from different people will have a different answer for each person. And sometimes the same answer may not work for everybody. And it could be something as obvious as like keeping kosher. It could be something that it seems like a no-brainer, that there are these foods that are allowed and these foods that are prohibited. And then somebody comes in with this other question that, as a rabbi, an Orthodox rabbi even, you find yourself saying, you know what, you can do this. And in order for you to do this, I would specify these things. So sometimes it's hard to give in a group situation questions that may be better to do in an individual situation. But I'm very happy to answer everybody individually on that. But
thank you, Rabbi. Other questions for Rabbi Jana?
Oh, I have a really short, localized question. What is it like in the B'nai Zion Temple in downtown Shreveport? Sorry, I know I'm far away.
So the B'nai Zion downtown temple is being renovated. It was our second building. We had one on Fannin, and that one burned down, so you can't see it anymore. We have some pictures of it and things, but that one, we have some pictures of what it was like. There are people in our congregation now who used to worship there. We moved into the current building in 1956, and that building got taken over by a church and then another church and a few different organizations. Recently, it was owned by we thought it was owned by a woman in California who was not always taking care of it. Someone recently found out that it was not. He's married to a judge here, and his husband found out that she didn't truly own that place, that she was mistaken. And so he was able to acquire it by, all kinds of, important financial ways. The building it had not been taken care of. There was a lot of damage to it. It's an old building, so a lot of it was wood, and the wood was rotten and things, but he is working hard to rebuild it. And his dream is to turn it into, you may have heard of the Sanctuary School, and it's like glasswork school here. It's an art school, and they're doing like great events and things like that there. He called it the Sanctuary School because he was hoping to have started it inside that building. It's a perfect size for him to do his glasswork art, but he also wants to turn part of that into a multicultural center with Jewish archives there, and hopefully be able to use it as a venue maybe for events, weddings, and things like that at some point soon too. But it would be awesome if it could get rebuilt. He's caring a lot about the historical aspects of it. Actually, I should always ask, there are parts of the building that he's trying to find if anybody has pictures of, like there were sconces, I think, inside the building that he's looking for. Anybody having, like, maybe somebody who did a bar mitzvah or something there and there was a picture, I don't know. We've been trying to find some of the old parts to it and some pictures of it, but his heart is in a really good place. But he and I have these conversations all the time about, he put out, and there was an article that was written about it that said save B'nai Zion, and so I had a lot of my pastor friends especially saying, are you in trouble? You need some help? We can help. We love you. And we're like, it's not us, it's the building. And I said, hey, dude, like, say save the B'nai Zion building. And he said, well, could we say save the historic B'nai Zion building? I'm like, no, we're in a historic B'nai Zion building now too. Could we say save? You sound like it's, we are still B'nai Zion. I can't help it if the name is over there on that building, but we are. That's who we are as B'nai Zion. And we're trying to, he, like I say, his heart is in a wonderful place, and I'm very enthusiastic to see the stuff that he does and to help support him. But it's really kind of a funny thing. But if you want to go in there, it's getting closer and closer to being able to go in. And I can show you some pictures. I did get to go in it around 2013, just before we finished renovating our sanctuary, which we finished in 2014. The lady in California who we thought owned it let this contractor in, who let us in so we could see it from the inside. There's some very cool things in there. They created this pulley system. We're going to talk reform here. I'm not going to lie to you. This is a reform thing, but they created this pulley system for the ark that was made with like a bicycle tire. And they had a thing on the ark we left there in the 50s, that you push a button and the ark opens up using this bicycle tire and pulleys, and you push a button and the ark closed down. And that was a big thing there for a while. So, but there, and he's trying to maintain the organ is still there. It's pretty cool in there and stuff. He's trying to maintain as much as he can of the original flavor and the original parts to it, and things that, like those sconces, things that he can't find the originals of. He would like to get a picture of it so he could 3D print them so that it could go back to some of those things, what the original might have looked like. So pretty cool. And if I can, I'll either answer more questions about that at another time. That's not about Reform Judaism, except that that's where a lot of the people who are, I think, about in their 70s and up, that obviously that would have been a place where they would have been at religious school and they would have gone to services and everything there. So I'm excited about that. By the way, the old Agudath Achim is now Rutherford House. And they're doing wonderful things there as Rutherford House on Line Avenue.
And that was, by the way, that was Jade, who I'm pretty sure you've met Jade before.
Okay. I can't see anybody. I see Herschel. I see Rabbi and I see Herschel. That's all I see. I see names on a list here, but I don't know who they are. I can't see you. Thank you. But so I can put you in touch with the guy if you want more information or to get involved or to see it or whatever.
That would be cool because we're acquaintances, but that would be awesome.
We should do some. So there are a couple of tour things that we should do for the Jewish historical community in Shreveport, because Agudath Achim is an historical community as well. They've been around for, I think, about 120 years now, and you've been around for about 120 years now, and the cemeteries have historical things happening. We've got 4 Jewish cemeteries in Shreveport. I mean, it's something that we should do one day is take the tours and create a tour and make it something that we all learn from, because it's part of the fact that we're here, whether you grew up in Shreveport or you're displaced like I am to be in this wonderful community. You feel like it's part of your history too. And that's really important that we make it part of our history, because we are part of the history now.
Amazing. That is true. You know, I've been here for 3 years and it still feels like, I mean, not even 3 years, and it feels like this history is really my history too.
Wait, you're going in the history books. When my kids were learning about the history of Louisiana, and I couldn't answer any of their questions, I had to look them up, and they still couldn't find them. Google wasn't helping at all. Then I became the first female rabbi here, and I'm like, I can't wait to have like grandkids or something here, because I finally know the answer to one question. I could do this. My only question.
Amazing.
And you're up on that wall too. You get to be the first female rabbi at the conservative movement up in the Northwest Louisiana, and it's awesome.
Well, thank you. And I will, if you'd like, Rabbi, if people have questions for Rabbi Jana, if you have more questions for Rabbi Jana, I'll give them your email.
Please.
And I hope that I can speak for you to say that you're always welcome at services at B'nai Zion as well.
Absolutely. I can tell you that at the moment we are allowing in person on Friday nights, if that helps you to know. We stay at 6 o'clock. We're not getting a lot of people. Our minyan is made up of the people online more than that. Saturday morning, we're still predominantly online. And if I can, if it's okay, because I worked hard to try to make the classes not conflict. I have classes that I started this week is our 3rd week, that I've got basic Hebrew classes on Wednesday morning at 11 and Thursday night at 6. And the Understanding Judaism class, which you don't have to take, you're taking this great one with Rabbi Sidney. But on Wednesday nights, just before this, I have a Jewish language class that I think you might have fun with. So if you need learning Hebrew or not, or, whatever you need, I'm happy to help too. She forgot to mention, I was the education director at Agudath Achim. When I moved to Shreveport, I was a member at Agudath Achim. I wasn't a member at B'nai Zion, even though I live half a block away from B'nai Zion, because I have a heart in the traditional and the Hebrew and the chanting of all the services and things like that. So my heart is at Agudath Achim too.
Thank you, Rabbi. All right. I want to take a few minutes just to just to close up here, thank you so much for sharing with us and for being our ever-present teacher in the Shreveport Jewish community. May I borrow one of those, that extra book that's over there? So what I'd love to do is, since we didn't have an Orthodox rabbi or clergy person here today, for those who are taking notes, I know at least one of you is taking a lot of notes. I just want to give kind of the answers that are present in the book if you're looking at the source book. So if you're in your source book, pages 42 and 43, there are certain questions that it asks about each movement. And I just want to answer those from a mainstream Orthodox perspective. There are lots of different opinions according to Orthodoxy, but there are certain things that hold true if you identify as Orthodox. We talked about its history. The approach to Jewish law and practice is that Jewish law and practice is binding. What it says in the Torah and Talmud is binding. There are lots of different theological reasons for that, but halakha does not change quickly. Some will say halakha does not change at all, but really, realistically, halakha does not change quickly in Orthodox tradition. So they believe that both the Torah and the Talmud are the Word of God and are binding. We'll learn about Talmud a little bit later as well, later in our course. Gender and LGBTQ issues. When you go to an Orthodox synagogue, one of the defining things of Orthodoxy is that there's going to be either a wall in the middle separating men and women, or there are going to be two levels separating men and women. So if it's a big synagogue, you'll have women on the balcony and men on the bottom. So men and women are separated. Some of the really, really progressive Orthodox communities will have what's called a tri-chitza, which will have men on one side, women on one side, and kind of mixed seating in a third section, but those don't tend to call themselves Orthodox as often. There are just starting, in the past 20 years or so, they started ordaining essentially female Orthodox rabbis, but many of them don't call themselves rabbi because that's too far. So they're halachic teachers. There are some who will call themselves rabbi, but they really are teachers of halakha and community leaders. In the Orthodox tradition, men and women are not seen as obligated to the same rituals, but for let's say the less progressive parts of Orthodoxy, for mainstream Orthodoxy and for ultra Orthodoxy, women are not allowed to do certain things, like say certain prayers or put on a talid or put on tefillin, or lead prayer services. In the more progressive streams of Orthodoxy, although women are not obligated to do those things, they are allowed to do those things. And that's the very, very progressive end of Orthodoxy that's really taken place in, like, let's say the past 15 years or so. LGBTQ issues, there's most mainstream Orthodoxy are not okay with LGBTQ identities. They won't perform a same-sex marriage. And the more progressive wings of Orthodoxy will honor people who identify as LGBTQ as individuals, but again, probably won't perform marriages, or won't invite them to speak publicly about their identities. Definition of who is a Jew, actually very similar to conservative Judaism. So either your mother was Jewish, or you went through mikvah, brit milah, and beit din. But what I will say is that the process leading up to beit din in Orthodoxy is very different than the process in most conservative congregations. If you wanted to convert in an Orthodox congregation, you would need to show that you are completely Shabbat observant for at least a year and a half, that you have a kosher kitchen and consistently keep kosher, right? No dating or marrying somebody of another faith tradition. So they're very different, different standards. And even in different Orthodox communities, there are different standards. But there is that difference. There is that difference, even though the technicalities of conservative and Orthodox conversion are the same, the process is very different. That's all of the facts that I have about Orthodoxy. Hopefully, we have somebody who's going to help teach us a little bit more next week. Questions, just kind of basic questions about Orthodoxy up until that point? Sure, Rabbi.
Rabbi Sidney, I was going to suggest if you want, and I'm sure you could do this, and I know especially if you can pull a rabbi or Orthodox, however you're pulling in an Orthodox expert, some of the classes that I've taken over the years were with Orthodox rabbis or rebbitzins, which in this case meant rabbis' wives, who gave glorious reasons why they think that these restrictions, what we might perceive in a modern world as restrictions against women, they saw them as glorious things. And it's sometimes worthwhile hearing that other side. Not that I have to agree with it, but it also helped to inform the kinds of decisions that we make about other things because of their attitudes about how glorious those things are. So if you ever want to hear that, happy to share that too.
Absolutely. And I'll say that the two reasons that I've heard the most is, one, if you read Talmud, the way that they interpret versus Talmud, it's, well, I mean, not just interpret, but the way that Mishnah and Talmud talk about women's obligation is that men are obligated this is very specific, but men are obligated in positive time-bound commandments, and women are only obligated, and negative commandments. Women are obligated in positive commandments that are not time-bound and in negative commandments, so the thou shalt nots. There's certain other things that, according to Talmud, men are obligated to do, women are not. And so if you've got that belief that God gave us these laws, even if it feels like, oh, I might want to do these things, I might want to lead these services, if your belief is that God gave us these laws, your belief is that God gave us these laws. So that's one thing. But then the other thing that I've often heard is the idea that women are born with a certain level of holiness, and we are so holy that we don't actually have to do as much as men have to do to get up to that certain level of holiness. So there's this special holiness that women have that men don't have.
How cool is that? There were other things. I remember being surprised about so this one class was about women in Judaism, and they said all those things. They talked about ways where they didn't feel at all denigrated. They felt just as equal, but there were three things that they felt that the modern world of Orthodoxy could do better. One was divorce. There's a lot of things about divorce that is terrible. And they tried to propose within the Orthodox legal system, meaning halacha, to be able to try to, that it could be there, but it's still not doing it. It was frustrating to them. So they were mentioning things like that. But the one that surprised me was when I loved being able to sit with my family. And I expected them to say that they didn't think that they needed a mechitza anymore. And this one rabbi's wife said, I think one of the things that I'm glad to have is a mechitza. And I'm like, what? And she said, well, when I pray, I'm praying to God and I don't want to be distracted. And so she said, if I sit next to a stranger and his leg brushes up against me, that's not distracting. But this woman already had, I don't remember, 7, 10, a whole lot of kids with her husband. And she said, when my husband's leg brushes up against me, it's distracting. And they had a mikveh in their house. That's how important that was to them. And I loved hearing her perspective. I loved knowing how intensely she liked to pray and that this was distracting to her. But yes, and all those other things too. But there were answers to everything. Us in our modern world were like, yeah, but, and she had answers to everything that just felt wonderful. The way her attitude about it was, it wasn't demeaning. It wasn't a tap dance around things. She had hit it straight on, and that was kind of sweet.
Right. The other argument that I've heard that I like to some extent is that really up until recently, women have been the homemakers, right, and have taken care of the children and have done the laundry and the dishes, and there's just not time to pray 3 times a day if you're dealing with 10 small children, right? So, so women are not obligated to do as much so that they have that space to take care of the house. Now, I have a teacher who, a male teacher who's Orthodox, and the way that he observes that actually with his wife is that when it's his turn to take care of the kids and it's his turn to bring the kids to school, his wife does the praying in the morning, and when it's his wife's turn, he does the praying in the morning, which is a very radical way of looking at it, but that's one way that his family deals with the halakha, deals with the Jewish law. So I'm curious. I would imagine that whoever is going to speak next week, if we have somebody, is probably going to be from one of those more progressive movements, because the people I know, the people I tend to know, I met while studying in a co-ed situation. So there has to be some sort of progressive ness to allow for me to actually be friends with them. But
it also it worked
and
the
also
other.
to use the internet, because a lot of Orthodox people will not use the internet.
Right. It worked the other way as well. I don't think that there was ever a Yontif service, a holy day service, that I had ever missed my whole life. And there was one year when Mrs. Zotskis, Zichrona Levracha, may her memory be a blessing, she had never led a service before, and she was leading Shavuot service.
Wow.
And it was essentially kind of what people might call an adult bat mitzvah. And I loved her, and I would have loved to have been there, but my kids were sick and my kid was throwing up. And my husband at the time didn't know Mrs. Zotskis as well as I did. I spent a lot more time at the shul than he did. And it wouldn't have meant as much to him to go see her. And we couldn't have both gone to see her. I wasn't giving my kid to a babysitter if he's throwing up or whatever. And I tossed and turned all night before the services in the morning, because I didn't want to miss Mrs. Zotskis' service. I didn't want to miss a Yontif service, but my kid was throwing up. And I felt like I should be home too. And it was like I felt this voice in my head. I don't want to make it sound overly dramatic, that said, you're not obligated to the positive time-bound commandments. I didn't have to be at services. I did have to be with my kid. And it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a spiritually important thing that I had to do at that moment. And I'm sorry I missed Mrs. Zotskis's service, but there are times when I get it. I mean, I really wanted to be with my child, helping him, more than I wanted to leave my husband with my child, helping him. And it worked out so that it was okay. So I don't know, that might not be great for everybody. It was a personal story that really hit home for me to be able to do that the way we did it. And Mrs. Zotskis understood.
Love that. Thank you. Here is my challenge for everybody here, because I know last time I said how long this would be, it was an hour and a half. So we have lots more to talk about today, but here's what I'm going to challenge you to do. If you've got this book here, or even if you don't have the book, if you have the chapter that I sent out today, I would love for you to look at pages 44 and 45 to read the part that says 4 rabbis, 4 denominations, just for 4 more perspectives about what all this movement stuff is and who these rabbis are. And then what I would like for you to do is to answer the questions on page 48. Which denomination of Judaism is closest to my identity and why? And although I am not some sort of Jew, I appreciate that they do something. So I'd like you to answer those 2 questions, and we'll start with that next time. after we answer those questions, we'll talk a little bit about the different cultures where Judaism has shown up over the past thousands of years, where we can find Judaism today. So that one thing, the one bit of homework that I'm gonna request is for you to think about, where do I identify movement-wise, or do I identify with a movement? Because there really are some wonderful trans-denominational congregations as well. So that's the big question. Thank you for learning with me. Thank you, Rabbi Jana, for teaching us, and thank you to Rabbi Wechterman as well. And I hope to see you over the next week, or if not over the next week, next week.
Thank you, Rabbi, for letting me come back and visiting the class. I missed it, and I really enjoyed every moment we had together learning. So thank you for letting me come back and visit.
You're welcome to come.
Thank you.
All right. Good to see everybody, even if I can't see your faces.